Institute. It's important. It really is humanity's best hope for the future, no matter what those above ground might think of us.
Hello, welcome back to the channel. It's me, Emmy the Cat Lady, and today we're going to take a deep dive into the Institute and their role as the primary antagonists of the main story of Fallout 4. So I thought we'd open with a quote from Father/Sean. "There has been too much posturing by too many groups. The world needs to know that we are in power and the Commonwealth is ours." And that's a direct quote from Father, who's the director of the Institute and also the protagonist's child. So the Institute are the primary antagonists of the main story of Fallout 4. They're the ones behind the inciting incident, and we spend the first half of the game trying to find a way into their facility to find our missing child. So who are the Institute, and are they good villains? That's the question we're hopefully going to answer today. So the Commonwealth Institute of Technology is the Fallout world's version of MIT, which is located in Cambridge, Massachusetts. It's an old university that is particularly known for the STEM subjects, your science, technology, engineering and mathematics. Robert House was an alumni of CIT. So it's not a huge surprise that the Institute is a science and research facility with advanced technology. That tracks. And it was founded by the offspring of CIT's original survivors after the bombs fell in 2077. They began to build underground, abandoning the ruined buildings above. They created sophisticated living quarters and research facilities, which was then passed down through the generations as they expanded both their infrastructure and their research. And despite this scientific utopia they have built, they are considered to be the bad guys in Fallout 4 and particularly feared by the majority of people in the above ground residents of the Commonwealth. So are they good villains? Let's start by talking about what makes a good antagonist and see how many of the points they actually manage to achieve. So, just like your protagonist, your antagonist needs an end goal and a believable motivation. So what do they want and why do they want it? They should have a superficial goal, like taking over the world, but perhaps a deeper personal goal, like wanting to be respected and make their mark on the world in some way. A good villain needs to be proactive, which means that they're actively working towards achieving their goal, whatever it is. Many protagonists start out reactive, so they react to the inciting incident and the outcome of that before they start actively deciding to pursue their end goal. But your villain should be actively pursuing their goal from the very start. They should also have some kind of power or strength that the protagonist needs to overcome in order to win. Again, it's fine if your protagonist starts out weaker than the villain, that's kind of the point. And this power could be military strength, magic, money, influence, superior technology, or a combination of these things. But there should be something that your protagonist has to overcome. And the antagonist needs to believe in their goals and believe that the end justifies the means, that they can justify what they're doing, at least to themselves, no matter how awful it is. There has to be a degree of immorality, so they're the bad guys, so their moral compass is going to be out of line with the protagonist and society in general. But for a better villain, I think we need to empathise with them in some way and maybe kind of see their perspective up to a point, even if we disagree with their methods and choices, as well as having a connection to the protagonist or one of the protagonists in some way, which helps add complexity and depth to the story, brings in more emotional beats, conflict and things like that. So, take Thanos from the MCU. He wasn't entirely wrong about finite resources in the face of a growing population and the inequality that comes with that. When there's not enough to go around, someone has to lose out, and the inequality is going to lead to corruption and exploitation. Does that mean that he should have gathered the Infinity Stones and just snapped away half of the living universe? No, of course not. But it adds a layer to the whole thing, and he expected gratitude for it. He was willing to sacrifice everything to achieve this, including Gamora, who apparently he did love, in order to get the Soul Stones. So, he believed that he was doing the right thing, but nobody else agreed with him, really. And another one that I find really interesting is Coriolanus Snow from the Hunger Games books. He's evil, twisted, cruel, and very petty. He does everything he can to subjugate the districts and keep them in line, and even his own people, as he tends to poison anybody who might work against him or embarrass him. If you make him angry or make him look bad, you're going to get a plate of dodgy seafood. And he is very intentional about it, and he believes he's justified in his actions. Although I do believe he's got a particular vendetta against District 12 because his girlfriend betrayed him as far as he's concerned. So he really does crack down more on District 12 than anywhere else, and that's what ends up biting him in the backside when Katniss Everdeen comes along. But we do learn from the Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes, which is his early life, that his father basically sacrificed everything his family had to fund this war against districts in what was called the Dark Days. And he nearly starved, and he witnessed someone taking a dead woman's leg to eat when he was only 8 years old. So you can see why maybe he wouldn't want to see another rebellion and a war with districts to happen because of what he went through during the First War. But he did learn the hard way that the more you oppress people, the harder they're going to push back eventually. And then coming back to Fallout, I do think the Master is a brilliant villain. Again, he wants to eliminate the pettiness, the hatred, the prejudice of humanity and stop it from destroying the world again. He's got a plan. Unity is the best way to achieve proper world peace. But he only failed really because his arrogance led him to skip doing some of his homework, and he didn't learn that his mutants couldn't reproduce without humans to dip, and the species would be a dead end. He only failed because his arrogance led him to skip doing some of his homework, and he didn't learn that his mutants couldn't reproduce without humans to dip, and the species would be a dead end. They say the road to hell is paved in good intentions, and to my mind that's exactly what the Master's story is. As I say, he had good intentions, but it went badly for him because things weren't quite what he thought it was. So, with the Institute, what is their goal? What is their reason for being? What is it they're trying to achieve? So obviously they're focused on science and technology and advancing their research. They're innovating, redefining mankind and advancing the future. They're the last best hope for humanity, except there's little evidence that they care about humanity outside of their sterile futuristic underground facility. They want to keep innovating, inventing and creating new technology forever. Okay, great. So the tangible goal is the mysterious Phase 3, which they talk about like it's some extremely classified secret project that's going to blow everyone's minds. It's power, the literal kind. It's a new generator that will allow them to be self-sufficient for centuries. Why that needs to be some big secret, I don't know. One look at the facility with its teleporter, its fancy lifts, the constantly running synth production machine and all the rest of it. Obviously they need a lot of electricity to keep that all running. So that's fine, we've got a clear goal and we can understand why they want it to keep expanding their facility and their scientific research and innovation. So the surface means little other than a source of certain resources that they can't make for themselves and a location for experiments to be carried out in less manufactured conditions, as well as a convenient dumping ground for their unwanted results like the super mutants. If there is anything on the surface they want, they'll find a way to get it because they believe their need is paramount and everyone else can go to hell. Cold fusion is a pipe dream according to Dr. Lee, so they need Phase 3 to work. And they state that their mission is mankind redefined, meaning the human-like synths, emphasis on like because they're not people, they'll never be people. Sean's constantly asking us what more he can do to ease our minds, what he can do to convince us that the Institute is humanity's best hope. He says this a lot in a very patronising kind of tone.
What else can I say to ease your mind?
And if they truly were doing the right thing, shouldn't their actions be convincing enough? Why would synths defect and escape if they're not capable of wanting it? They also talk about phasing out the older generation synths and switching all synth tasks over to the Gen 3s. How does that benefit mankind? Isn't that just going to put more pressure on the SRB? They already have an entire department dedicated to reclaiming these escaped synths and trying their hardest to figure out the defects in the code that makes the synths leave. I'll come back to this point later when we talk about the guerrillas. So, are they being proactive about their goals? Yeah, it sure looks like it. They're working hard on Phase 3 alongside the director's vanity projects, which we'll also get to later. They're looking for data on reactor efficiency, and they wiped out an entire settlement to get it. University Point was a settlement where people were doing well, they were a good trading outpost with a good crop of razor grain to offer for other necessities, And in 2285, a young woman who lived there, Jacqueline Spencer, she salvaged an old terminal's hard drive and found Stuart Campbell, a professor at the Mass Bay University, had a lot of research on reactor efficiency. So she contacted a trade caravan to look for a buyer for the data, which brought down the institute. They demanded the town hand over the data, made a bunch of threats, and this caused strife and division within the town, thanks to the fear of the institute, and a mob was forming. Jacqueline learned that she didn't actually have the data, but she set out to discover where it was in an effort to save the town. But it was too little too late. As far as the institute were concerned, the synths came in and wiped the town off the map. So yeah, they're being proactive. They manage to be more so if you decide to side with them, and you'll get given quests related to the goal after you do the Battle of Bunker Hill. You go to Mass Fusion to get the beryllium agitator, and that puts you up against the Brotherhood of Steel because they also want it for Liberty Prime's power issues. So doing that quest for the Institute means the Brotherhood see you as an enemy. If you're siding with the Institute, that's to be expected. We know that the Brotherhood are not going to tolerate the Institute's existence. And then after this happens, you get sent to Grey Garden. So next to the robot farm, there's a house, and there's a man called T.S. Wallace who lives there, and he's hiding from the Institute. So it turns out that he has expertise in something related to the reactors, and they know that he has the knowledge that's going to help them, but he's refusing to come out, and you need to go and solve the standoff, because generally it's the Minutemen he calls for help, unless you've literally not even met Preston Garvey yet, in which case it's Gunners. But if you're a general of the Minutemen, then you have to either talk them down, kill them and become an enemy of the Minutemen, or you can side with them, which will get you banished from the Institute, which is an easy way to initiate the Minutemen ending, because it's an easy way to get banished from the Institute without firing a shot and having to escape. But you can convince him to stand down and solve it all peacefully, and convince Mr. Wallace that actually he'll be quite happy in the Institute. So, they're not against bringing in outsiders that have the knowledge and the intelligence and the skills that they need. Dr. Lee being another example. Obviously we know her. She came from the Capital Wasteland, and she obviously must have learned about the Institute from Dr. Zimmer, and after everything that happened in Fallout 3, she decided she wanted to try and make contact with the Institute, and did end up working there. So interesting one there. But then after that, you need to take out the Institute's enemies, so you have to assassinate the railroad leaders, and then we have to go and take down the Brotherhood of Steel. Makes sense. The railroad have been a bug in the Institute's code for a long time by freeing the synths, or at least helping synths that have escaped to stay free. So the Institute can't hold on to their power if the slaves keep escaping to freedom, but they never really took the railroad that seriously before. The Brotherhood came here with the express intention of going to war with the Institute. Sure, our intentions are peaceful, do not interfere, but very quickly after they arrive, Elder Maxon is pretty clear that that's the goal, is to find and destroy the Institute. Their technology is too advanced, too dangerous, and can't be fully controlled by the Brotherhood of Steel. So the Institute needs you to take down the Bucketheads and their airship and their giant death robot before things get into the Institute, and destroy them first. So, they're clearly at odds and opposite sides of the same coin in some ways. So that's all well and good. So power, your antagonists are supposed to have power that the protagonist needs to work to overcome. They're not a good villain if beating them is simple, after all. That would make for a very boring story, whether it's a movie, a book, a game, whatever. There needs to be some challenges and some difficulties and something for your protagonist to overcome, so that they can learn and grow and advance and have character development and all that stuff. So what does the Institute have that gives them an advantage? Quite a lot, let's face it. They have power, and I mean literally, they obviously need their shiny new Phase 3 reactor, but they do have access to plenty of electricity to have the lights on and keep their synth production line going non-stop. It's not surprising that this level of technology, research and manufacturing needs a lot of kilowatt hours. They have their advanced technology, you can't really deny this. They've got their fancy laser weapons, endless robots, synthetic gorillas, coursers, cybernetic implants, the Gen 3 synth slaves. there's a lot more, but tech-wise, they're definitely ahead of the game. And obviously, the big one, the teleporter, or the molecular relay. But it's a teleporter. How it works, I'm not sure. Maybe it's like the one in Star Trek, but it's pretty amazing, and it allows them to send sensing people wherever they want in an instant, and also means that it makes it very difficult to find out exactly how to get into the Institute because they don't have a door because they're using this teleporter. So it definitely makes infiltration and surprise attacks easier for the Institute as well, that they can just deploy synths at will wherever they want. And numbers is part of that as well. Who can possibly threaten you when you have an endless army of fighting robots you can deploy in seconds anywhere you like? The Gen 3 synths are good for infiltration, spying on the Commonwealth, and looking out for anything the Institute might want to claim for itself. But they can also send out armies of the Gen 1 and Gen 2 synths to strip places bare of anything useful and kill anything that gets in their way. And protection as well, so the scientists don't leave the Institute, or very rarely do they leave the Institute. They send their synths and or Kellogg, and then when Kellogg's gone, you kind of fill the same role that he did to do all the above ground stuff. So people can't find them because they're hiding underground, and they use their teleporter to get around, which you need to have access to their technology to use, with the signal hidden in the music radio station, and you need a special device to be able to use it. So you need to Institute technology. And even when you do, if you side with the Brotherhood or the Minutemen and you go to blow them up, you have to brute force your way into the place somehow to get into the actual facility, because otherwise, once you declare yourself an enemy of the Institute, obviously they're not going to let you keep using their teleporter, so you have to find another way in. They also have a lot of spies and information. They've got a network of informants that includes pretty much all the trade caravanners, even Trashcan Carla, Tommy Lonigan of the Combat Zone, AJ the Chem Dealer in Goodneighbour, and Henry Cook the Barkeep in Diamond City. So they've covered all the major settlements and the minor settlements as well. And let's not forget the crows that you see everywhere you go. They're all synths with little cameras inside them to spy on whatever the Institute wants. You see several of them outside Vault 111 as you merge, and they turn up everywhere, so you've been watched since you left the vault. And some people know that at least some of the crows are spies. Deacon mentions it at one point. But it means that they can keep track of you, so Father can actually see you left the vault, and then you went to Concord, and then you went to Diamond City, and all the rest of it. So he's been keeping an eye on you, but it also means that the Institute know what's happening on the surface. They have to be aware, the super mutants are thriving and killing people. They have to know what's going on, because they're investing all this technology and spying on the Commonwealth. So they're fully aware of what's happening there. And they don't care. So now we come to immorality, which is related to them spying and things, that they know exactly what's going on. So your villain needs to be the bad guy. Right, that makes sense, that they're doing things most people would consider morally reprehensible. Makes sense, doesn't it? So I've compiled a list of the Institute's crimes for you, and needless to say, they definitely get an A+ in this category of villain development. So they were part of the original attempt to form a unified regional government, the Commonwealth Provisional Government. However, the director at the time disliked the bickering and arguing, so when they perfected the molecular relay in the 2180s, the Institute just washed their hands of the surface and stayed underground. They just sent their synths up to scavenge on the surface instead. Fine, that's not an issue, but take a listen to this recording that you can find in the boardroom on the top floor above the director's quarters, talking about that and the situation and what happened.
Look, Director, I'm gonna make the same recommendation I did last time. We did everything we could. 4 years dedicated to preserving this Commonwealth Provisional Government. You've seen the same reports I have. It's falling apart, and fast. We need a plan for what happens when that fall is complete. I know some of the other divisions have suggested we just cut off all contact, hide underground, and pretend nobody's home. That would, in my opinion, be a mistake. We can't just give up on these people, and with the android program, we don't have to. We'll soon have the capabilities to deploy androids to the surface in great enough numbers to maintain order. Just think about it, all right? Keep it in mind moving forward.
Then, in the 23rd century, they began working on their organic synth project, making synthetic people that were flesh and blood but programmable like robots. So the FEV research project was part of this, and they discovered that they needed some undamaged pre-war DNA. Obviously, they had access to Vault-Tec data to know that Vault 111 existed and suited their needs. I assume they must have known the nature of the experiment, that, it's clear if you look at the terminals in Vault 111 and with what Sean says, that the Institute have the ability to remotely control the Vault systems in order to let them get in and also for you to be let out at the beginning of the game. So they sent Kellogg and a scientist to take baby Sean to harvest his DNA for their synths in 2227, and they took the baby, because babies can't say no. Adults can refuse consent and will fight back. A baby won't. And it means that they can raise him and shape him to be a good little scientist. And that's why he's known as father, because he's the father of all the synths, which kind of makes you the grandparent of all of them. So I hope you didn't romance Paladin Dance. Because technically, he's like a grandchild of yours. As the guy's a bit weird. So most people are aware of the Institute, but they're mainly concerned with the aggressive robots that scavenge on the surface. Yet it was only 2 years later, in 2229, when the surface learned what the Institute had been doing in their underground hole all that time. So a man called Mr. Carter joined Diamond City residents at the Central Bar, which is now Takahashi's Noodle Bar, and they drank and they chatted away, and everything was great, until he developed this odd tic of twitching in his facial muscles, pulled his gun and opened fire. He shot Henry, who was the barman, several other residents, until Diamond City security managed to put him down. They noticed there was plastic and metal inside his head, which confirmed that he was a synth. The organic synths were here. So here's another director's recording, which is kind of a reaction to that particular incident, where they talk about it and what happened. That it was called the Broken Mask incident, so take a listen.
Damn it, Galton, what the hell is going on down there? I have to convene an emergency directorate meeting because of this screw-up. That synth was a prototype. It was absolutely not ready for field testing. The mess it caused in Diamond City threatens decades of work to keep us out of the spotlight. I will be very clear. My legacy as director will not be tarnished by your division's mistakes. I am going to find out exactly who approved any sort of operation above ground, and that person will be held fully accountable.
So this was apparently a malfunctioning prototype that hadn't been approved for field testing yet, and the scientists who had sent it to the surface got in some hot water over the incident. But the damage was done. The Commonwealth knew the Institute could now create synthetic people who appeared to be human until they were killed. So fear and paranoia spread along with the story of the Broken Mask incident. People were worried that someone close to them had been replaced to spy on them, and this paranoia only grew over the next few decades. Now, it's not completely unfounded either, since we know that the Institute has planted synths everywhere, and there's also synths that might not be working for the Institute everywhere. So I've got another list. Paladin Dance. You do discover this when you follow the Brotherhood quest line. But Paladin Dance came from the Capital Wasteland. He was sent ahead to scout by the Brotherhood, and he had no idea that he was a synth. So likelihood is that he was one that had a mind wipe and was smuggled out of the Commonwealth. We know at least one other synth that ended up in the Capital Wasteland this way, and that the Railroad were active in that area in 2277. So there's probably several people in the Capital Wasteland that are actually synths and don't even know it. Then you've got Magnolia, the delightful singer at the Third Rail in Goodneighbor. It's unclear if she knows she's a synth or not, but she's a very interesting one. Mayor McDonough, this is one that you'd tend to uncover at the end of the game. So the real Mayor McDonough was actually Hancock's brother. They became estranged after McDonough's anti-ghoul plans for Diamond City when he was elected mayor. So he's been replaced, and the synth version reports on the Commonwealth back to the Institute. So clearly they want to have control of the largest settlement around. Makes sense. Roger Warwick is an interesting one. So he's self-aware, he knows he's a replacement, and he's there to do field experiments for Bioscience Division with testing out their seeds for crop yields and all that kind of stuff. And one of his employees is suspecting that he has been replaced. And if you ask the kids mention that Dad's a lot nicer than he used to be, so they've not kept the same personality, clearly. That, you know, it does suggest that Roger, the original Roger Warwick was, whether he was actually abusive or not, I don't know, but, you know, he wasn't a nice guy, but the replacement is a lot nicer, which is strange, but that's a thing. Sturgis is also a synth, at least he does drop a component if you kill him, although he's marked as essential, so you have to use the console really to be able to do that. But he does have a synth component, and again, you've got to assume that he doesn't actually know that he's a synth. Then there's the Sole Survivor. It's a popular fan theory, and Dima alludes to it, given that your earliest memory apparently is when the bombs fell. You can't really be sure that you're not without dying, but being frozen could have also caused potential brain damage and led to amnesia, so there's that. People do point out there's Terminal Entry in Robotics that discusses a project to give a combat visual display for units expected to fight that sounds just like VATS, and that's evidence that you're a synth because you do have VATS before you get the Pip-Boy. I'm not convinced, but it's a neat idea, and I think it is fun to have a little bit of a question about that of, are you really the original, or are you a synth replacement? It doesn't really fit with the story that well, but it's an interesting theory nonetheless. So, shortly after the Broken Mask incident happened, a new round of talks began with representatives of all major settlements invited to try and form the Commonwealth Provisional Government again. And the Institute demanded a seat at the table, and they sent a Gen 3 synth in as their delegate. Said delegate killed everyone else present at the talks. So, the Institute didn't want to lead the Commonwealth, but they didn't want the peasants of the surface world forming a functional government either. Why? Because if people organised, they could get in the Institute's way and move against them. And Sean does explicitly say this at one point, that that's what he's worried about, is that if people on the surface got together and stayed organised, they could attack the Institute, they could cause problems for the Institute, they could get in their way. And obviously we discussed earlier the incident at University Point, and I talked about it. There's a Wasteland Biographies video about Jacqueline Spencer, but she hadn't even found the data yet, but just the threat from the Institute was enough to tear the town apart and start a mob. Jacqueline tried to fix it, she tried to get to the data, but it was too late. The Institute were not patient enough, and they just came in and wiped out the town completely. Could that have been handled another way? Yeah. They chose the evil option. They could have just paid her for the data. What does it matter to hand over a few hundred caps to one girl for data that's apparently so essential that they're willing to wipe out an entire town over it? They could have negotiated with her, or even just made sure she actually had the data before firing a single shot, but no, we're just sending in the robot army because we don't care. The super mutants, which I have covered the Commonwealth variety at length, and we know that the source of the super mutants in the Commonwealth is the Institute, so we can definitely hold that against them. The FEV project was started as part of the organic synths, which is fine, but once they got the data needed to find Sean, use his DNA and make all their synths, they kept the FEV project going, and it was just churning out super mutants, which seems to have been going on since before the bombs fell, or at least very shortly after. If you look at Swan, his story as the unique super mutant behemoth at Boston Common, who was a janitor that worked in CIT and got caught stealing cigarettes, and as punishment he was used as a test subject. FEV initially boosted his intellect, and then it took a sharp decline. So they dumped him on the surface, and he found the swan boats in the pond and just decided to join them, since he was also a swan, because his name was Edgar Swan with two N's. So he just thought, yeah, this is the place for me because they're swans, and that's where he stayed terrorising the city, anyone that happened to walk past Boston Common. And then when Brian Virgil took over the project, he began to ask questions about what the point of it was. They weren't learning anything new. The results were causing harm. And he did sabotage the project. He destroyed most of the data, turned himself into a super mutant, and he left. And this was all covered up by the director, and that Sean is the one that did that. So the majority of the Institute scientists don't even know exactly what happened. And it's very clearly a cover-up because Dr. Lee does ask questions about it. She was friends with Brian Virgil. And if you are doing the Brotherhood and you are trying to recruit her, then one of the ways that you can convince Dr. Lee to leave the Institute is to show her proof of what actually happened to Brian Virgil and how it was covered up. And you can also find an entry in the doctor's terminal about someone suffering from blunt force trauma to the chest in the FEV lab, but other details have been redacted. The only other redacted entry is Sean's own personal medical information because he's hiding the fact that he's dying too. They could have put a password on the terminal, but they didn't. We're just going to go in and edit medical records instead. And if you look at just the sheer number of super mutants on the surface, the behemoths that only attain that size by living for decades and decades because they keep growing through their life, that's a kind of mutation unique to these variants of FEV. So this tells us that the Institute's been pumping out the big green brutes for a long time. Why aren't they just terminating and disposing of them as test subjects? And we know they don't care about the petty squabbles of the Commonwealth. They have enough spies on the surface to know these mutants are not dying off, but they're thriving, they're kidnapping people, killing people, eating people. So what could they gain from this? Well, my thought is it's this whole thing about their fear that if everyone in the Commonwealth was united under a single banner, they could be a threat to the Institute, which is obviously the case depending on which faction you decide to side with at the end of the game. Anyone other than the Institute, you get enough people together, you take the fight to them and you destroy them. Obviously, being the protagonist means that you play quite a big role in that and ensuring that your chosen faction wins. And the Institute wants to keep people from organising and getting in their way. So letting dangerous mutants run rampant is going to help keep people isolated and keep people afraid and stop them from kind of getting together. So what is the motivation here? It's not just about the pursuit of knowledge and scientific research. The Institute believe they hold the key to saving what's left of humanity, at least what they deem worthy of saving. Like we've not heard that one before. Mankind Redefined. They want control over their own people, their property, and the Commonwealth itself. They claim to have no interest in the lives of people on the surface, but if that's the case, why are they planting spies, sending their crow cameras to monitor major settlements and replacing people with synths? And I think it's an interesting point here. If you look at the division logo for robotics, it's red blood cells. It's not anything mechanical, anything that you would typically associate with robots. It's erythrocytes, the hard-working little oxygen carriers that keep humans and other animals alive, because now their synths are flesh and blood. It's synthetic, but it's flesh and blood nonetheless. But they're still talked about as property. Any that develop free will or free thinking will be reprogrammed and put back to work. If they don't manage to escape to the railroad, those that do escape are hunted across the wasteland. There's an entire department for the reclamation of synths. And I can't imagine people have missed the allegory of the synths in the Institute and the Underground Railroad. It's an allegory for slavery, which is a huge part of our shared history between Britain, Europe and the USA. When people were rounded up, sent to a foreign country and sold like produce to the highest bidder, mistreated, forced to work and live in horrible conditions and killed for the slightest hint of rebellion. The stuff that actually happened was, there's not even words for how atrocious it was. It really was that bad, and the Underground Railroad was a network of safe houses and safe routes to smuggle escaped slaves to a place where slavery was abolished and they could be safe. It's far beyond the scope of this video to go into this detail of this history, but the UK does have a lot of responsibility for it. We were very much involved in the transatlantic slave trade. Let's be real, the UK and England especially were more often than not the villains in world history. Let's be real. But this is the issue with the synths. They've made them so much like humans that they've developed sapience and sentience. They form opinions, they have emotions, they feel pain, and they're mistreated. They're experimented upon without consent because they are property, not people. You can overhear a conversation between a synth and a doctor in the clinic where the synth asks, will there be pain? And the doctor's like, yeah, I suppose it's your job to find out. And in real life, clinical trials and human testing in clinical trials is the very last stage. And by that time, they at least have an idea of the potential side effects. And also people have to consent to taking part in these trials. And I know this because I have taken part in clinical research. I have psoriatic arthritis. So I took part in a research project where we're comparing it's a way to predict the effectiveness of one drug over the other based on blood markers. So I had to go into the hospital regularly and get a bunch of blood taken and all sorts of things. So, but I had to fill out a lot of paperwork to consent to all of that before I would take part, but they don't do that with the synths because they're not people. And then there's another conversation that you can hear where the two scientists are discussing a request for a synth memory reset. So the second scientist lists his reasons: ineptitude, aggression, disorderly behaviour, overall insubordination. So he's preempting a high-risk situation. He wants his synth reset because they might be thinking for themselves. So we reboot to factory settings and start again. And you can't really do that with humans, realistically. And I think there's an interesting thing, and this is something that they don't seem to have anticipated. So if you check the terminals in the bioscience division, you can find a report about some behavioural anomalies with the synth gorillas. So let's have a read at it. Okay, so here are the details you requested re the gorilla behavioural anomalies. A total of 16 instances of heightened aggression have been documented. Bioscience personnel who witnessed these events, myself included, would categorise the level of aggression displayed as extreme and dangerous. In all, 6 synth handlers have been destroyed by gorilla attacks. As for what triggers these behavioural changes, I speculate that it's a reaction to perceived conflict. Several attacks followed heated arguments that took place within earshot of the pen. Another occurred soon after the recent SRB security sweep. It seems clear there's a fault in the behavioural model. I doubt it can be corrected. I know you're against it, but I think we have to consider destroying them. Failing that, I recommend that all contact with the gorillas be limited to synth units only. Bioscience personnel should not be permitted to come into contact. The risk is simply too great. There is a typo in that. That tells us a lot. So the gorillas have been aggressive towards people in their enclosure, especially after there's been heated arguments outside their space that they could hear. Is that a fault in the behavioural model, or is that normal large primate behaviour? Gorillas are pretty closely related to humans. They can understand our body language, our tone of voice pretty well, and they can, they're going to be aggressive towards a perceived threat. There's even cases of gorillas learning sign language to the point of being able to name a pet kitten and express grief when said cat died, which was a car accident, and to communicate with people, to ask questions and things like that. So you meet gorillas and you're surprised that they're acting like gorillas. It's bonkers. So imagine that you're out in town just walking and you hear 2 people shouting and screaming at each other. They're strangers to you, but they're clearly having a massive fight with each other. Do you feel a wee bit of a quickening in your heartbeat, tension in your muscles, sharpened senses? That's your fight or flight kicking in because there's potential danger nearby. And that system in your physiology is primal, it's automatic, and it's difficult to control. It doesn't know the difference between you going to a job interview and running from a bear. It's going to react the same way. And all animals have this system, which is your autonomic nervous system and your fight or flight response, or they have some analogue of it. And gorillas are no different, and being large and powerful animals, they're going to be more inclined to fight than flee, especially if they're trapped in that tiny zoo enclosure, because honestly, the enclosure they've got in the Institute is awful. It would never be allowed by zoological standards in our world, but they've got nowhere to run, so they're going to stand and fight, and fully grown silverback is not an easy opponent. They're very dangerous and very strong, and I think ignorance of normal gorilla behaviour is one thing, but I think it's important to note the rest of that entry. So we must only allow synths to go into the gorilla enclosure from now on because it's too dangerous for real people. The synths feel pain, at least the Gen 3 ones do. The robotic ones would be torn apart pretty easily, I think, by a gorilla, but it's too risky for the real humans, of course. So they create synthetic gorillas that are virtually indistinguishable from the real thing, and then when said gorillas demonstrate normal gorilla behaviour, they're all shocked and they're hunting for the errors that cause this aggression. Sure, they've probably never met a real silverback, but they must have had some data on the species in order to recreate them. And the same thing applies to the Gen 3 synths. They've literally made synthetic humans that do everything humans do. They even have a digestive system and they can eat and drink, although apparently they don't require it to survive. Side note, what is powering them then? They have like fusion cores in them. It's interesting. Or if it's something that they've managed to make kind of synthetic metabolism based off oxygen, I don't really know. But they make these synthetic humans and they make them as much like humans as possible, and then they're surprised that they start acting like humans and developing free will. And nobody anticipated this. So they want the synths to do all the menial work for them, to be test subjects and to do as they're told. If they begin to show too much free will and decide that they're unhappy with the life they have been granted, then they get sent for a memory reset to make them compliant again. It's pretty dystopian, right? And whether you believe synths are people or not, they are living things that can feel pain and emotional distress, so at that point treating them as property and forcing them to do things against their will, including inflicting pain during experiments, it does become a bit of an ethical quandary. And there are notes and conversations that suggest that the Institute want to phase out the Gen 1 and Gen 2 synths over time and start using the Gen 3 synths for everything, which are the ones that are the most like people. There's even a memo from Father that you can read on a couple of terminals which talks about using the term synth, not android, as some of the older members use. Dr. Zimmer prefers the term android, and it's acknowledged in this note in Fallout 3, and this is acknowledged, but he wants to embrace the power of the synth because it's more appropriate for these truly synthetic beings. But some of the things they do, it's hard to see what the point of it is, like replacing random people in towns with synths. The random encounter of art versus art, where you kind of see a kill and replace happening in front of you and you have to decide which one's the synth and whether you want to intervene or not. So they made a copy of this random guy and sent the copy to take out the actual human version. And why? What's the point of that? But they basically just want to have control over everything, and it does seem likely that eventually they are going to put themselves in charge of the surface as well when they feel the time is right. I don't believe for 1 minute that the Institute intends to stay underground forever. Just like Vault-Tec, the Enclave, the NCR, the Legion, they all want to be the ones in charge because they believe their way is the best way. On this point, I think it's clear that the Institute are on track to be antagonists. So, a villain is far more interesting if we can understand their perspective, even while disagreeing with them. Sean and the Institute do believe that the end justifies the means and that what they are doing is right. Can we see how they came to that conclusion? I struggle with that. They claim to be doing what's best for mankind, which apparently includes preventing any kind of unified government, spying on the Commonwealth, replacing people they can't manipulate with synths that they can control, dumping dangerous mutants on the surface to kill people, wiping out an entire settlement because they might have access to data the Institute wants, and recording propaganda. So before we get into the Institute, let's have a quick look at some of the villains I mentioned earlier and see if we can see their perspectives. So Thanos has seen the downfall of his home planet because the population outgrew the available resources. He learned that this is happening across the universe and there's severe inequality, poverty and suffering because of that. He wants to fix it before the universe implodes on itself, which is a noble goal, but the issue is how he chooses to deal with it. So he just starts going to planets and executing half the population before deciding that using the Infinity Stones would be much more efficient. And he does succeed. That's the thing, and I think that was the most interesting thing about that, is that Thanos won. And he just didn't really think that anybody would be able to or would try to stop him. And then obviously they did manage to undo it, but there was loss and sacrifice and they managed to undo it. But, you know, he was in his way trying to help the situation. And President Snow, I think, you know, witnessing the cannibalism and you know, nearly starving and dealing with that, and the consequences of the war. So by the time the 10th Hunger Games came around, which was 10 years after the end of the war, his family were still poor and pretending to still be the kind of wealthy high society people they were, because no land's on top, as he likes to say. He didn't want another rebellion and war with the districts because of what he went through. And he's manipulative, and he discovers that he's got a knack for taking people out that might get in his way, and he begins killing his way to the top and doing all he can to keep the districts in line. He's almost certainly behind most of the changes that happened in the Hunger Games as time went on. And I think the Master's in a similar position. He wanted to prevent another world-ending war like what happened in 2077. He believed that the era of humanity was over and it was time for a new, better way without all the petty fighting and violence. And he's not entirely wrong either. So these villains have got a point. You can see that their belief that only they can solve the issues and that their way is the best way, even if they end up hurting people in the process. It's the methods and choices that make them the bad guys. For the Institute, I struggle to see it. They just don't seem to have any interest in solving the problems for the Commonwealth, despite what they claim. So I think the propaganda is an interesting thing to look at here. So when you're siding with the Institute, you're given one last task before you turn on the new reactor. You need to record a broadcast for the Commonwealth to make sure that they know where they stand. You're going to be the new director, so it's something you need to do. As we said at the beginning, the world needs to know that we're in power and the Commonwealth is ours. So let's have a wee look at the script. So, people of the Commonwealth, for years now you have suspected that the Institute still exists, that we are among you. It is true, but it's not the whole truth. We are. And at this point you get 4 options. So there's nice, there's neutral, hopeful and aggressive. The hopeful one is the one that's written in the script, the note that you're given. So the nice one says we are here to help. Neutral says we are in control. Hopeful says we are the future. And the aggressive one, we are your new masters. Then our superior technology represents the future of the Commonwealth. Today we activate our nuclear reactor, ensuring that we will persevere long after the world above ground has ceased to exist, ensuring that mankind has a future. We have no desire to interfere in the unimportant details of your personal freedoms is the nice one, pointless struggles is neutral, daily lives is hopeful, and pathetic existences is aggressive. We simply ask that you do not interfere with Institute operations. To do so would result in, the nice one is tragedy for all involved, the neutral one is unnecessary difficulties, the hopeful one is dire consequences, and the aggressive one is complete annihilation. And then you may rest easy, know that the future is underground, nice, looking bright, neutral, in safe hands, hopeful and out of your control is the aggressive, and that mankind will thrive under our guidance. So they do state outright their overall goal. No matter what choices you make in the dialogue, Sean will let you broadcast it. Even if you choose the aggressive options, he calls it interesting and tells us it'll certainly get our point across. It does sound like he approves of that. So they're making it clear who they believe is in charge of the Commonwealth, and they're laying claim to it all. And that's fair enough, and it confirms their villainy. It's just hard to see that they have a point, and I think it's because they don't really show us how much they believe in their actions. You know, you get a lot of, oh, I know it was hard, but you have to accept it's for the best. They talk about how horrible it must be to live on the surface, but most of them don't know what it's really like in the wasteland. They're complacent, and that leads to apathy. It's clear that they don't actually care about people on the surface. They're the bad guys, so that's fair enough. It's just hard to see their convictions sometimes. They think their society is perfect, yet it doesn't take much for some of them to defect. Brian Virgil had a crisis of conscience, but even so he was more concerned with the pointlessness of the work. And it doesn't really take a whole lot to convince Dr. Lee to leave and join the Brotherhood of Steel again, even though she despises them and has done for at least 30 years, if my math is correct. It would just be good to see more of a demonstration of why the Institute is doing what they're doing, why they're handling issues the way they're handling them. Why did they choose to wipe out University Point instead of just buying the data? They have caps to pay off the trade caravans. And even just the opportunity to question Sean about this, about the Institute's ways of handling things, about his beliefs. It's just, we're the bad guys, so we do what we want, or is there a reason that they're unwilling to take a more peaceful route to solving conflicts with the surface? So one thing that really makes antagonists complex and interesting is if they have some kind of connection to the protagonist, like how Darth Vader reveals he's Luke's father in Star Wars, and Fallout's no different, as of course the director of the Institute is our son Sean, except he's older than us now and has lived an entire life while we were frozen. So this means that Sean has had 60 years to come to terms with his origin story since he left the vault. He knows what happened, but he's been raised by the Institute and he's over it. From your perspective, the time between your newborn baby being kidnapped by Scary McScarface and you leaving the vault yourself was minutes. You had no indication of how much time has actually passed. And whatever emotions you might have from your spouse being murdered and your baby being kidnapped, they were frozen with you. You didn't have 60 years to get over what happened. You get maybe hours before Preston Garvey's yelling at you from the balcony to help them with the raiders. Only a handful of people really acknowledge the gravity of your situation. Codsworth, Mama Murphy, Nick Valentine and Piper. And half of them are robots, by the way. I love Nick Valentine, but he is a synth and he has more empathy in his circuits than your flesh and blood son. So at the first meeting with Sean, it sounds a lot like gaslighting to me. So he says the Commonwealth has nothing to fear from the Institute, but all evidence we have shows that the people's fear of the Institute is not unfounded. There are many instances that people still remember. For example, if you do the Covenant quest and you meet Dr. Rosalind Chambers at the compound, she'll tell you why she's trying to find a way to detect synths, and it's because her parents were killed during the Broken Mask incident. So she's torturing people and killing them because she wants to prevent anyone else from suffering what she went through. And it's very much, if he wants to convince you that the Institute is right, then, barefaced lies when you potentially know some of the stuff that the Institute has done on the surface, and it's not really necessarily a great way to convince you by just kind of gaslighting you with it. And Sean must care about his childhood to some degree, thinking of what could have been if he'd been allowed to grow up with his parents. He started the Child Synth project, making a 10-year-old synth version of himself, which he's quite obsessive about, according to Dr. Lee's notes. He also leaves the synth child to you if you choose to destroy the Institute. Is he going to age, or is it a Peter Pan type deal? Do synth children age, or do they just stay children forever? And it does speak to some regrets about his lost childhood, and it is probably something that he's thought more about because he's learned that he's dying of terminal cancer. On that note, why the hell didn't he tell you that in private first? If he really wanted to kind of convince you to stay on side and that you were a family again, why did he not tell you that he was dying in private? You have a private conversation with him on the roof of CIT after the Battle of Bunker Hill. 5 minutes later, you attend the directorate meeting and then he drops that bombshell and names you as his heir. He couldn't have pre-warned you about this? No, because he doesn't really care about your feelings. He wants you to be on board, to join the Institute, to lead the Institute, but he makes very little effort to make you feel like he sees you as family, which surely would be a way to convince you to be on side. And he might not be emotional about this stuff because, again, he's had more time to process the news, but surely the director of the Institute is smart enough to realise that you might. You left the freezer, searched high and low across an irradiated wasteland full of horrors and giant bugs, killed a cyborg mercenary, and finally found your son. And he used the synth child as bait because he does resent Kellogg for what he did, even though apparently he forgave him. But he wanted to make sure that Kellogg died so that you could get your revenge. But you've gone through this roller coaster looking for a baby, then a child, and then discovering your precious baby boy is an old man. You're expected to be grateful for the gift of being his heir. He treats you like he's your parent, acts like he's wiser because he's older, because you were frozen in time for 200 years. And your version of the timeline places the murder of your spouse at maybe a couple of weeks ago, but Sean doesn't have any time for your emotions or sentimentality. He's only interested in convincing you that the Institute is right. And his reason for letting you out of the vault is apparently one of pure curiosity to see what you would do and if you would try to find him, if you would survive the wasteland. He expected you to die, but he wanted to know if you still cared. And I do think part of this was triggered by his diagnosis, knowing that he was dying, so this was his last chance to potentially meet the surviving parent, and he wanted to pass on the Institute to someone he was related to, which is a very bizarre move, because, you're new to the whole thing, you don't know how the Institute works, and neither of his parents are scientists. Their pre-war jobs was the male protagonist was a soldier and an Anchorage veteran, and the female protagonist was a lawyer, so it's a very strange move to do that, and you can understand, I think, why the other directors are just like, what the hell are you doing? That's the stupidest thing I've ever heard, because it just makes no sense, and whether it's just that he wants to give you all that trust to convince you to be on board and that kind of thing is very strange. But the synth child, Sean, and he let you find the synth child first to see how you would both react. It was part of the experiment, part of the testing of the synth's emotional responses. It's also a horribly cruel prank to play on you. By this point, your character is still expecting this to be your actual son, only for this old man to be like, yeah, you thought, I'm your son and I'm now older than you, and then later he tells you that he's dying, and there's just so many twists and turns for you to end up just back where you started, really. And from the player perspective, it all seems a bit forced. There was a lot of memes about the game when it came out, joking about being too busy wastelanding and building settlements to bother looking for Sean. And that's a failure of the inciting instinct to motivate the player. Why should we care about our spouse being killed? Their personality is so bland and generic, they might as well be a bloody synth. We know their name and that they once had sex in a park and conceived Sean. Nameless settlers have more personality. And Sean himself is a baby in the opening. He's too young to have developed a personality yet. We could have had the exact same story with Sean being a toddler, at least able to talk. You compare that to Fallout 3, where you have several conversations with your father, with your childhood friend Amata, bullying incidents with Butch. There's a lot happens in that introduction in the vault, so you do have a chance to get to know these characters, and that means that you can develop an opinion about them. You can decide if you like them, if you don't like them, and whether you care. But in Fallout 4, you don't get that chance. I think it would have been much more impactful if we had a slightly older child, like 4 years old maybe, old enough to have a personality developing, but young enough that it could still be influenced by the Institute's upbringing. And I've already mentioned the reason for choosing the baby over any of the other people in the vault is because babies can't say no. Who cares about consent? There's no ethics board to stop you from doing what you want, so they're going to take the one that can't fight back. So I think the game opening, we could have done like family dinner and movie night on the Friday night before, spend a bit of time with our child, with our spouse, and then wake up in the morning to the news of the bombs and having to rush to the vault. And a small child could still potentially go into the cryopod with a parent, so everything else could play out as it does, but we might care a bit more about the stakes. And Sean doesn't see any moral or ethical issues with what the Institute does, even on things that were done before he arrived there. And the FEV project is an example. He refused to shut it down when Virgil raised concerns. He covers it up when Virgil sabotages the programme. He has no interest in attempting to negotiate with the Railroad or the Brotherhood. He was in charge when everything happened at University Point. And he sends you to Libertalia to take down the leader who's an escaped synth, to prove to you that the synths must stay under Institute control because they are dangerous if they're allowed freedom. But not every raider is a synth. There's plenty of human criminals and evil people in the wasteland, and there's plenty of synths that are harmless. So he's using this to justify cracking down on the escaping synths and the Railroad's activities. Kind of like deciding a certain demographic of people are all criminals and dehumanising them to justify subjugating them. Obviously that's never happened before in human history. So he says when you come back, I know the task was difficult, but I needed you to see firsthand how dangerous a rogue synth can be. A rogue synth can be dangerous, sure, but so can human beings. Libertalia is only one location of many that are controlled by raider groups, and each of these groups has a leader that's often named, and they're not all synths. In fact, on the wiki, if you look that up, there's 31 gangs of raiders, one of which covers the three groups at Nuka World under Coulter. So, as far as I can tell, Gabriel's the only synth raider gang leader in the game. So, again, if the primary concern was the danger posed to people on the surface, wouldn't it be helpful if they sent their coursers and synths to take out these raider gangs, whether they're synths or humans? No, of course not. So it's not about safety, it's about control and keeping a hold of what they see as property. And this is just an attempt to try and convince you that the synths need to stay in the Institute and that it's very important that we stop them escaping. And if you just say, I'm just happy to stop a killer, then Sean responds with, it doesn't matter though, if everyone sees the Institute as a villain, dangerous forces could align against us. You know, obviously. So it's very clear that his intention is to prevent people from getting angry enough to organise an attempt to stop and destroy the Institute. The choice of language, I think, here is very important. He doesn't want them to be seen as the villains, yet when you speak to him on the roof of CIT after Bunker Hill, he said that he wanted to see the Commonwealth for himself to confirm that the Commonwealth is dead and not worth saving. Because there's lots of ruined buildings, I guess. He knows what's happening in the Commonwealth. We know that because the Watchers and their sins provide plenty of intel on the surface. But it's clear that what the Institute say they want and what they actually do don't align, which is not unusual for a villain. They think they're doing what's right. They believe in their choices and actions, which is a good thing for a villain, although with the Institute, I feel like their belief in their choices and their actions could have been shown better than it was. But Sean's clearly trying to manipulate you to convince you to believe in his cause. So, you need to look at what they're asking you to do as well. So, when you're deciding who you want to side with, you need to go with your morals, or at least the morals of the character you're role-playing as. It's important when deciding who to side with to look at what they're asking of you. Actions speak louder than words, and if their expectations are not aligned with what they claim matters, questions need to be asked. So, let's have a look at some of the other quests the Institute sends on. These are mainly the main quests. There's obviously side quests and radiant quests as well. So what is it they expect of you, and why do they want you to do it? Are they expecting you to go against your morals and ethics, and what if you refuse? So after you do synth retention, you have to go to the Battle of Bunker Hill. So the Institute know that the railroad are operating from Bunker Hill, and you need to reclaim more synths from the railroad. So tell me, what would you do when someone is stolen from you? Sean says, except the railroad doesn't steal synths. They're helping synths that have escaped on their own. They don't have a way to access the Institute or communicate. Again, he's talking like someone stole his credit card or something, not about living beings with free will and sapience. And then you get the option to warn the railroad and or the Brotherhood of Steel. And both leaders say to you they would have had no idea if it wasn't for you telling them, yet they both show up to the battle no matter what, whether you warn them or not. And it's really, really strange, and it's really chaotic, and it doesn't make any sense. It feels like we're just going to shove everybody in there so that we have a big dramatic four-sided battle. And you then have the option of, recalling the synths, freeing them or killing them. And it's just bonkers because you have this talk with Sean on the roof, and he's angry if the synths weren't recovered, and depending on your dialogue options, you can be banished at that point if you admit to liability for the lost synths. Otherwise, he will let you stay, but he'll be upset about it, and he's happy if the synths were recovered. But at Bunker Hill, the battle there is just, he's angry that the Brotherhood were there and the Railroad were there, and they shouldn't have known about it. And it's like, if you didn't tell them, who did? It's so weird. But after this, you go to your meeting and you learn that he's dying and he's named you as heir to take over as director, and everybody else is very upset about this because they don't know you and they don't know if you're intelligent enough or trustworthy. They point out that you're not a scientist, but they can't really do anything about it. And then they talk about, they finally tell you what Phase 3 is, this essential project to keep the lights on. Fine. During this, there's a little bit of a rebellion happens where a couple of the bioscience guys are protesting your promotion, and they've locked themselves in the biolab where the food is, and you need to go and deal with it. And it's interesting, you have different ways. You can try and talk them round, you can just go in guns blazing, or you can set loose the guerrillas to fight them. And again, it's one of these ones that just seems a bit haphazard because, nobody really kind of cares what outcome you have here. I mean, people will be like, oh, well, I'm glad it didn't need to come to violence and blah, blah, blah. But the stakes aren't really very clear. What are you doing? Are you just establishing your leadership style here? Is killing them going to make people respect you more? And if you're trying to join the Raiders, then sure, killing people make them respect you. But the scientists, do you want them to be afraid of you? What's the point of this other than, just pointing out that some people aren't happy that you've been named the incoming director, which I think is reasonable because it just doesn't make much sense. But no time for any more of that nonsense. We need to go to mass fusion. But the Brotherhood are also there, so you become their enemy, which they somehow know before you get there because of psychic powers or something. But you fight your way to the thing. You then need to convince a man named T.S. Wallace to come to the Institute, as his expertise is essential. And this is the point where you can get banished from the Institute without fighting your way out if you side with the Minutemen instead of talking Mr. Wallace round. We go to war with the Railroad and then the Brotherhood and we wipe them out completely, which is a nice dramatic way to end the game. I do like the idea of using Liberty Prime against the Brotherhood, but you do have to decide, do you really want to wipe out two entire communities of people to protect a bunch of scientists who don't care about the surface or the people fighting to survive there? And I think the start of Airship Down is very weird, and again, it feels a bit disorganised because, Sean says, go and talk to Dr. Lee about the next steps. And you have Liberty Prime as your question option on the speech wheel, even though literally nobody has mentioned this giant Doom robot to you. Liberty Prime was destroyed at the end of Broken Steel, so you would have no way to know he was back if you haven't done a Brotherhood run. And then the other scientist talks like you know all about Liberty Prime, and nobody's mentioned it. And it's just, and they're like, do you know about Liberty Prime? Like, no, nobody's mentioned anything about this. And they just seem to assume that you knew, and I think that's a failing in the speech system and in the organisation of the steps of, introducing the quest. It's like they've just skipped a few steps and not done it properly because they just want to get to the big exciting battle. That's the thing. It's like rushing you instead of actually saying, look, this is the plan. We're gonna, Liberty Prime is this giant robot that was built that the Brotherhood have, and we're going to send a virus in to reprogram it. They don't take enough time to kind of fill you in. They're just like, oh, you know about Liberty Prime, right? Okay. And you're just like, wait, what's happening here? And they're just skipping the steps because they want to rush you in to get into the big exciting battle where you attack the airport and all the rest of it. So, are the Institute good villains? Certainly, they're doing some morally questionable and unethical things. They want their power and control over people's lives. They're perpetuating slavery, performing dangerous experiments, and going out of their way to harm the people of the Commonwealth. Just like all the other antagonists in Fallout, they want to be in control and they believe that they're the best hope for mankind's future, or at least their version of that future. And just like Fallout 3, I do feel like the game is trying to force certain emotions on us as players, more so because we have a voice protagonist now. And obviously the voice actors were given direction on what emotion to convey for each dialogue option. And I think there should be more emotional connections and complexity based on your relationship with Sean. Especially if you choose another faction and then you actively kill him yourself. That's got to be complicated for your character emotionally speaking. But forcing emotions on your audience is not good writing. Almost all good writing advice centres around letting your audience fill in the blanks themselves, from show don't tell to don't let characters say what they mean. Spelling out how your audience should react is not the way to tell a story. So like those laugh and applause signs you see for like theatre and TV shows where they want the audience reaction recorded, so they prompt the audience to do a specific thing. So you need to give just enough information for the audience to figure out what's going on and leave a little bit of room for interpretation as well. You have to trust your audience to be able to do that for themselves, and especially when you do want to evoke certain emotions. Successful horror writers will tell you that sometimes it is about what you don't put on the page, it's what the reader does to themselves when they're trying to work out what's going on. And it just falls a bit flat for me. There's so much else going on in the Commonwealth that is kind of far more interesting to explore. The beginning, the urgency of running to the vault is there, but the connection to your spouse and your baby is meaningless. There's just not enough there to really make you care. And it's making you do too much work to try and establish a relationship and emotions, because there's just nothing there to work from. You're just supposed to be upset about your spouse and child because the game says this is your spouse and child, you love them, and you're going to be upset when they die or get kidnapped. And Father's not really a character that makes it easy to see his point of view. He's patronising, he's arrogant, and he's cold. He apparently cares about you enough to follow your progress and let you out of the vault and see if you try to find him. Obviously, there's part of him that wants to meet you in person before he dies, but he doesn't really attempt to treat you like family or get to know you. He makes assumptions, he gives you no space for any emotions that you have. He's got no time for you to talk to him about his life. He's happy you killed Kellogg, but he doesn't even do the decency of telling you he's dying in private when he had plenty of opportunity to do so. He does it in public with no care for how you might feel about it. And then he just hands you control of the institute when he dies, and there's nothing wrong with a child naming their parent as next of kin. I have no children, I have no intention of having children, so I have to look to other family members. But it's strange that he suddenly decides he trusts you so much to put you in charge of what he values the most, which would be nice if we knew anything about him. There's no connection other than blood, and it's also very easy to get banished from the institute by saying the wrong thing to Sean. So it's weird how easily he decides to trust you, which you maybe shouldn't do. If you're down the railroad end and you're working for the institute for quite a large part of that before you betray them. And there's just no, there's not a lot that shows us, what they actually believe, and, that they have this conviction and they have a reason for it. So it's, obviously they are the bad guys. They have the capacity to do a lot of good for humanity, which they say they want to do, but everything they do is the opposite of that. They've sabotaged the government attempts in the Commonwealth. They don't want the settlements to cooperate. They've directly caused harm across the wasteland. They are evil, they're morally reprehensible, but they just lack a bit of depth and complexity. And siding with them doesn't really change much about the world. The ending's just, my son's dead, I'm in charge, and it's business as usual. And you being in charge, you don't really have much of a say in anything. You just still get sent on raiding quests by them because you're the one that goes above ground. And just like in the Fallout 3 video essay, I think the ending of a story needs to be satisfying, and especially if you decide to side with the bad guys, which these games do let you do, at least Fallout 4 and Fallout New Vegas let you do, but you should still have some kind of satisfying ending for that, even if you have become the bad guy, and the world needs to have been changed in some way, for better or for worse. Your protagonist needs to be changed in some way. So the ending needs to feel earned and make a difference to things. And I think all the other endings where you destroy the institute, they do feel satisfying, and you have changed things. The synths are free, or the wasteland's better protected by the Brotherhood, or the Commonwealth has a network of cooperative towns working together to improve things. But the institute just goes back to their mad science, and you get to do radiant quests for them. It would be good to at least have something different to do as director, to potentially have to have meetings and get them to work on new projects that might give you things. They could have done something with that and let you lean into being the bad guy more. So I think they're adequate, but they're not great as villains, because there's some things that just don't make sense. There's a couple of points where it feels like the game's just like rushing you into getting to the exciting part and not giving you a chance to really understand and decide for yourself if this is what you want to do and if you're okay with this. It's just all a bit chaotic, and I think the battle for Bunker Hill especially, that just, none of that makes sense at all. Like, it would make sense if you go and say to the Brotherhood, oh yeah, the Institute are gonna attack Bunker Hill to get some synths back, and then the Brotherhood show up. Sure, you told them this is happening, here's where it's happening, they turn up. But the fact that you don't do that and then they turn up anyway, and how did they know? Nobody was supposed to know. It's just pure chaos. And as I said, I think if Sean was a little bit older and we could actually maybe talk to him as a toddler or something, other than just, this is your baby, you have to care about it because it's a baby and that's just how it is. And, you know, if Sean felt conflicted about anything, it's just, yeah, there's not really much there. And a good antagonist makes you feel something, even if it's hatred towards them. That's kind of the point. You know, and obviously the Institute aren't the good guys, but a lot of it's just not that interesting, and there's not really much kind of consequence to siding with them for anybody. You can't really lean into the evil with them, and I just feel like it's kind of lost potential, because a lot of what the Institute are like was established pretty early on, because it was established during Fallout 3's production for the Replicated Man. It was one quest, and an interesting quest. So they and Fallout 3 came out in 2008, Fallout 4 came out in 2015. That's a long time for them to have, you know, potentially worked on this and actually developed the Institute more into really good, interesting villains. And I think, you know, the railroad side of things actually shows us the dark side of the Institute more, with the slavery allegory around the organic synths, this technology that was created to emulate humanity and is unsurprisingly emulating humanity. And the organic synths are created in man's image. The human body is quite the feat of engineering. But the moment that artificial intelligence develops sapience and sentience, it gets dangerously close to true humanity. And humans don't like being controlled. Humans want to think for themselves, make choices for themselves, and live their own lives their way. It's not out of the question that artificial humans would be the same way, but the Institute wants control, so Straith synths get wiped and reprogrammed to behave and do as they're told, wiping away their own identity to start again, and if the mind wipe goes on, they're disposed of because they're just property. But the one thing that comes to mind about the Institute that I can't really find any answers for is that we know that most of the people there are descended from the original survivors at CIT, and they very rarely allowed outsiders in. They obviously do let some in, like Dr. Lee, but it seems like they have to show some real promise in terms of, you know, scientific capabilities to be invited, other than Kellogg, I suppose. But most of them seem to have been born there, and you can even talk to a kid who says that he doesn't want to do boring science. So what happens to people born that don't show any aptitude for science? So they want the synths to do all the menial jobs like cleaning, building, cooking, all that stuff. So it means that all the people in the Institute are going to become scientists. Are there kids born that are terrible at science and don't want to work in the labs? What happens to them? Are they exiled? Do they go used as test subjects? Are they just born good at science and indoctrinated early? Do we have a eugenics program going on with selective breeding? Only those who are good enough at science get to have children. You know, and again, things like that. That would be another facet to the Institute that would make them more villainous and more complicated as villains. That, you know, they're saying they want to preserve humanity, but only the parts that they value, you know, and selective breeding, that's something that's been going on for a long time. That's the reason that bananas don't have seeds in them anymore, and we have dairy cows that can produce massively more milk than they used to. And if you just look at the variety of dog breeds that exist, that, you know, it's something that we have been doing, but when it comes to doing that with humans, it's a lot more complicated. And, you know, it's the practice of letting only those who are successful, healthy, intelligent, or highly desirable features have children, while preventing those who do not have those desirable features from reproducing, like not allowing disabled people to have children or people who are a different race. I can think of one group that did that in the 1930s. So it does sound like something that the Institute would do. And again, it would, you know, they're redefining mankind, they're improving on mankind, they're making people better. And, you know, even having something that would indicate stuff like that, you know, stuff that's going on in the background, and there's little bits of it here and there. I just feel like things could have been a lot more interesting and a lot more complicated. They could have made things better. And it definitely feels like a couple of the sort of late game main quests were a bit rushed, that, you know, there's it just ends up being pure chaos, and you're just like, I have no idea what's going on, and you're trying to kind of figure it out. It's very odd, but we needed more reasons to care, and, you know, none of the factions are perfect, and certainly, you know, there's going to be positives and negatives to them. The Brotherhood are very stubborn and militaristic. You know, the Railroad they're the good guys as well, I would think, but, you know, it's the Minutemen are supposed to be kind of the default. They're the option that you have when you don't have any left, kind of like Yes Man was. But, you know, you can really be put off the Minutemen as well, because you just get sent on all these, you know, Radiant quests and settlement quests, and you're just like, what the hell is the point here? And I think the characters and the factions could have definitely been better developed. I feel like the Railroad were pretty well developed. Everything kind of makes sense with them. The Brotherhood as well. The Minutemen, it could have been, I think, doing things a different way with the early quests of the Minutemen might have made things more interesting. And the Institute, things were definitely a bit rushed and a bit chaotic in places, which I think really kind of, you know, I would rank it down in that regard, that it definitely could have been done better in a way that was more interesting and more enjoyable to play through. And I love Fallout 4. I love all the Fallout games, as you know. I've never really played Brotherhood or Tactics right enough. I do have them, but I've never really played them, and I know they're kind of supposedly not that great. But it's one thing I do feel about sometimes Bethesda's RPGs is that the main story plot lines can be less interesting than side quests and other factions. Like I've mentioned before, you know, Oblivion, when I first played it, I never even got to Kvatch, as I was too busy doing other stuff. But the Dark Brotherhood plots in both Oblivion and Skyrim are really, really good. And the Thieves Guild quest in Skyrim, I think, is really, really good. But sometimes the main stories are just a wee bit too bland. But these kind of side quests, quest lines, they do show that they can write these things well. They can create these really interesting storylines, but the main stories just get a wee bit too, you know, bland and tedious. Whether that's maybe an issue that there's too many writers working on the main story, the saying that too many cooks spoil the broth. If there's too many people working on things creatively, then that can sometimes, you know, make it less cohesive and less interesting. And I do think that the Institute could have been better as antagonists than they were. Like, you know, you've got the forced drama with the Battle of Bunker Hill, as I've said, and it's somehow your fault that the Brotherhood and the Railroad turned up when you never told them. They must have just had a psychic vision or something. Maybe Mama Murphy told them, I don't know. And the whole thing about Phase 3 is really weird. Like, they make a big deal that this secret plan that they can't tell anyone about is classified. It's only for those high up enough to understand it. And then you find out and it's just like, yeah, we're making a better reactor to produce power. Why did that have to be such a big secret? And it just feels like they're trying to kind of force you to be intrigued and force you to be curious about what this big mystery Phase 3 actually is, and then it's so anticlimactic because you're just like, oh, it's just more electricity. That's amazing. Especially when you consider like some of the technology the Institute already has with their teleporters and their artificial people and their gorillas, and you know, and it's just like, oh right, okay, Phase 3 is just a better generator. That's great. And why was that such a big secret? It's so weird. And you know, they could have given you some more moral difficult choices, like sending you to help with a replacement or to shake down settlements for resources or something like that. If you're going to side with the bad guys, then they should let you be the bad guy. Like, they nailed this in Nuka World when you decide to become the king or queen of the raiders, and it does at least make sure that Preston Garvey will never speak to you again. So it can be done, and the writers in the game can produce this kind of story and let you be the villain and embrace it and things. And I feel like the Institute, you should have been able to really embrace. If you're going to join the bad guys, then get to be one of the bad guys in a significant way. But you never really want to try and force your audience to think things or feel about things. That's not good writing. You want to let your audience fill in the blanks a little bit themselves, because they're going to find that much more satisfying and enjoyable if they get to then decide for themselves how they feel about it and what it means. The stakes need to matter, and with Institute it just really doesn't. And it's much more impactful to the world to destroy the Institute, which I think is far more interesting. So there was a lot of potential there, and something definitely kind of got lost along the way when we were travelling from Washington DC up the coast. And I love Fallout 4. It's a lot of fun to play, and I love the crafting system and the settlements and everything. The Institute's a fun place to explore. It's all clean and sci-fi, all this advanced technology. There's plenty of aluminium, and the morality and ethics are definitely on the dark side, which is good, but they could have done with more development. And there's just not enough clean fluffy towels and flushing toilets to convince me to side with them, unless I'm role playing as someone that's evil, and then I'm kind of all in. But and it's the whole thing, like, you find your son, and then no matter what you do, he does end up dead, and then it's like, okay, that's sad. Anyway, you need to go and do this thing now, and another settlement needs your help and whatever. And I think part of the issue as well is the voice protagonist and only giving you 4 speech options, and I know that's a feature a lot of people didn't like. And I do agree. I do remember many a True Nerd's video essay on the subject of the speech system, and John made really a lot of good points about that, like how you have no idea what words are going to come out of your character's mouth when you choose an option. I get they didn't want to have the voice actors record 40 different answers to the same question, but we needed more than just sarcastic to understand what we were about to say. And that, I think, made it harder as well, because you could click an option and think you were going to say something along one line, and then it's something completely different, and you just don't know what's going to happen or how people are going to react. But yeah, then you just move on and nothing really changes. There's more synths wandering about the Commonwealth, and that's that. But if you do destroy the Institute, as it turns out, sometimes we kind of break the laws of physics and reality when we blow them up, because if you return to the crater, you see these synths spawning and dropping into the water forever and ever. But I think destroying the Institute is the right thing to do for the Commonwealth. There's no doubt about that. They've caused a lot of harm, and they are effective enough as antagonists. So if you do want to be a good guy, then I think destroying them is a morally good thing to do. But if you want to play a villain and join them, you can, but it could have been made better and far more interesting, I think, than what it was. So that's my thoughts for the Institute. It's I would say I was a little bit disappointed, really, when I kind of first played Fallout 4, that it just wasn't quite as engaging as I thought it would be. So my first playthrough, I actually ended up doing a Brotherhood playthrough, and that one felt the most kind of interesting to me at the time. But I do think the other endings are interesting in their own way as well. The other 3, they're obviously the same outcome, but you approach it in different ways which fit with the different factions that you're dealing with. The Brotherhood, you take Liberty Prime, who makes a big hole in the ground so that you can get in. And with the Railroad, you steal a vertibird and you do all these things. It's interesting and it's different, but it's kind of a shame that things definitely could have been more interesting than they were. But as always with these things, I do love to hear your thoughts. If you have anything, do you agree with what I said? Do you disagree? Obviously, keep everything polite and respectful, but some of what was said today was obviously my kind of opinion and perspective on things, so it might be that you feel differently, and I would certainly love to chat about it in the comments, so let me know, and I'll catch you all in the next one. Bye.